So I'll start just by saying that the person who should really be doing this with Jonathan is not me. It's Jeff Spinner-Halev. Jeff didn't. I know I'm throwing him under the bus. It's really not. He didn't think he was going to be back from Chicago. He is here now, so he'll ask some intelligent questions from the peanut gallery. But I do want to give some love. Jonathan has written several books. Jeff has a recent book out called Respect and Loathing in American Democracy. Nobody has any idea what you're talking about, right? What are you talking about? Polarization, moralization, and the undermining of equality. The whole idea of the Shabbat Limmud series is really to capitalize on the many brilliant people who we have in our community and to give us the opportunity to have Shabbat together, to eat together, and to learn with each other. Next November, I don't have the date in front of me.
I think 15th.
November 15th. Our friend and teacher, the Imam Abdullah Entepli, will be coming, and so we hope that you will sign up for that. And we are figuring out a way to continue this program going while I am on sabbatical in January. And I am confident that somebody early in our lineup, probably in January, will be Dr. and Professor Ed Halpern, who always has interesting things to teach our community. So stay tuned. And we thought that, I don't know, did you know that there's an election?
I have some awareness.
You have some awareness.
What I did not know was that my team would be playing in the World Series starting tonight.
Oh.
That was a mistake.
This is a real test of your commitment as a Jew. We are appreciative.
Yeah.
Sandy Koufax moment for you.
Yes, that's true.
Jonathan is a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina. He is also the undergraduate head of global studies at the University of North Carolina. He also has served, a little birdie told me, has served as an election monitor internationally in other elections overseas, and has a wonderful Substack that I highly recommend you subscribe to. I can't remember the name. What's the name?
It's called Quality Kvetching.
Quality Kvetching. So really, what else could you ask for?
It's jonathanweiler.substack.com. That's the easy way to find it.
And I will just say, tomorrow morning, as we do most Shabbats, we say a prayer for our country. And as I said on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish people, we are very, very lucky. We are luckier than 98% of the Jews who have ever lived. That we live in a place and a time in history when we can participate in the selection of our leaders. I don't think that I'm speaking in hyperbole by saying that this is one of the most consequential elections in the history of this country, consequential for the country and for the Jewish people. And it is a great honor that we have, and even mitzvah, for us to participate in the democratic process. And as we have this conversation on a Friday night in shul, I think we do so with a sense of hope and prayer and yearning for the future of this country, that it continues to be a place of freedom and continues to be a place where the Jewish people and where all people, especially those who have been oppressed, can thrive and find opportunity. So with all of that in mind, I'm now going to turn it over to Jonathan. I'm going to listen carefully. I'm going to try, and I had somebody feed me one good question to haze you. And then I'll ask a couple of other questions, and then we'll turn it over to some questions from the community. I didn't select someone, so now I'm going to select Yoni. When the time comes, you're going to take that microphone and walk around and give it to people as they ask questions. Okay, appreciate you.
Yeah, okay, well, Rabbi Graber, thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you all so much for being here on a Friday night. I'm going to start by, and I'm not going to spend too much time lecturing to you. There's kind of three, maybe sort of higher order points I want to make about American politics, and then happy to take whatever questions you have. And just so I remind myself, I'm going to start with the outline. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about undecided voters. Then I'm going to talk about polarization. And then I'm going to talk about, and I've already forgotten the third thing and then I'm going to talk about the Electoral College. So I'm going to start with those three things, and then we can take the conversation in whichever direction you want to go in. So I was thinking about this earlier today. There's lots of different ways we can divide the world into two different types of people. But one of the ways we can divide the world, in the United States specifically, into two types of people is people who pay attention to politics and people who don't pay attention to politics. And I would put as a special subset the people who are crazy enough to show up on a Friday night to synagogue and listen to me yammer on about politics when, for example, they could be home watching the World Series or doing something else. I'm sort of joking and I'm sort of serious when I say, I think for people who are the political obsessives, and I'm going to count people in this room in that category just because you're here, I think it's hard for political obsessives to appreciate how atypical we are in the United States. That the great majority of Americans do not follow politics all that closely, do not have in-depth knowledge about bills being passed, or even everybody who's on the Supreme Court, that if you ask them basic questions about sort of civic knowledge, a lot of people just don't know the answers to those questions, including many people who are going to go vote. Okay, so there's the subset of people like us, and we are a small minority. There's a much larger group of people who are certainly paying some attention, they care a lot, they have a very clear and strong political identity. And I'm going to talk more about them in a few minutes when I talk about polarization. But I think one of the things that makes it difficult to orient ourselves to thinking about politics and to following the election is we have a lot of people who know enough to know very clearly which party they identify with, which candidate they like, which candidate they don't like. And that dominates sort of our coverage and the coverage of and our understanding of politics. And then you have a much smaller group of people who really, I guess I think of them as kind of truly up in the air voters who don't really have nearly as clear an idea of who they politically identify with. They swing from one election to the next. They might actually split their tickets. And they, actually Jeff was telling me the other day, he read a little nugget that of the undecided voters, one thing he saw said that 25% of the undecided voters will not decide until they're in the booth, in the election booth, who they're going to vote for. And I can see the looks on all of your phrases. Who are these maniacs who don't already know who they're going to vote for? And what are they waiting for? So I just want to say a couple of things about those undecideds. One is, they are undecided in the sense that they tell pollsters they don't know who they're going to vote for. But otherwise, I'm not even sure it makes sense to even think of them as a singular group, because they're not undecided for the same reason. Some of them do know stuff about politics and they follow closely, and they're just sort of, there's lots they don't like about one candidate, but lots they also don't like about other candidates. Sometimes they're called the double haters. But there's a whole group of people who are even less kind of informed than that. And they may tell pollsters, for example, and we've been hearing this a lot the last couple of months, they're waiting to hear more details of policies and proposals and plans from politicians before they make up their mind. And for many people, that's just not true. They may say that, but the truth is you could give them as much information as you want, and they're still not going to know because they just don't think about politics in as clear and ideological and systematic way as most other people do. And I mention this both because it's very frustrating, and also because they are so consequential for the outcome of elections. And I think one of the challenges, and again, for people who are the obsessives who, sort of can't stand the idea that we have to wait another 11 days and probably longer to find out who's going to win this election, is that this election is going to come down to people who it's very hard to poll, it's very hard to model. We're just really not going to know which way they break in many cases until the last minute. They may split 50-50, in which case the polling we have, which we can talk more about, will be relatively on the money, we think, or they may break predominantly one way or another. But all of these things are very elusive for political scientists, for pollsters, for analysts, for people who follow this stuff closely to figure out about this group. So it's this sort of frustrating but interesting paradox that in a way the most important people in this election, the most important voters, are the ones we have the least insight into. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing, I just want to talk a little bit about polarization. I know you've heard that word a million times. It's in the subtitle of Jeff's book. It's in the title or subtitle, I think, of every book been published in political science in the last 10 years. I'm only exaggerating by a little bit. But I just want to say a little bit about its nature. And I know some of you have enough life wisdom in this room to have lived through the 1960s. You remember other very polarized times in American history, so much so that there are some historians, really great historians, who will say that what we're experiencing now is not so different than previous periods in our history. But I want to talk about, and these are sort of statistical and wonky on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think they give us a good sense of why I think we are in fact in a distinctive period of polarization. It's not just our imaginations, and the fact of this distinctive period of polarization, I think, is causing sort of a level of distress and anxiety and sort of an assault on our nervous systems that is not so typical in American politics. So 2 data points I just want to mention. One is wonky, but I think kind of interesting. Actually, my longtime friend and co-author Mark Hetherington did a study about 25 years ago. It's considered a classic now about polarization in the United States, which begins with elites polarizing, that is getting further and further apart. And then because we generally so closely follow the cues of elites that we follow, that has made Americans in general more polarized. And one kind of data point that he showed in this piece he wrote 25 years ago is that it used to be, there's a database that shows, I won't get into the details, the ideology of every person who's ever served in Congress going back to the first one, okay? And it's based on how they vote on issues, et cetera. It's not so useful until about 50 or 60 years ago, but it used to be that on a liberal conservative spectrum, there were plenty of conservative Democrats and plenty of liberal Republicans. And until the late 90s, if you put them all on a scale from the most liberal to the most conservative, there were always Republicans who were more on the liberal end of the spectrum than at least some Democrats, okay? And sometime around 1999, that changed. So since 1999, the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the least conservative Republican. So they have completely detached, ideologically speaking. And I think, again, in a way that's a wonky, but I think it's a really sort of important visual, if you will, of what has changed in the last 25 years. And so that's at the elite level. At the level of the masses, that's us. Another data point I just want to share. So political scientists have these things called feeling thermometers. They used to be actual like puffy, real thermometers like stuffed animals, but a thermometer that they would bring into people's houses and ask people how they felt about Republicans or Democrats or Jews or the Yankees or black people or Muslims. It's a feeling thermometer. If you give something a 0, it means you feel very coldly toward that thing. And if you rate it 100, you feel very warmly toward that thing. So just to give you a couple of data points here, in 1976, to take an example, the year Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford in the presidential election, when pollsters asked people, when they asked Republicans, how do you feel about other Republicans? The average score was about a 75. Okay, so Republicans feel warmly toward other Republicans. If you ask Democrats, how do you feel about other Democrats? The score was also the same, about 75. Democrats feel warmly toward Democrats. If you ask the same question today, if you ask Republicans how they feel about Republicans, Democrats how they feel about Democrats, nothing has changed. The average is still 75. Okay? Democrats feel about as warmly toward Democrats as they did 50 years ago. Same for Republicans. However, if you ask Republicans about Democrats and Democrats about Republicans, in 1976, the average score was about a 50, meaning not hot, not cold, to quote Goldilocks, just right, medium, right in the middle. Both for Democrats about Republicans, Republicans about Democrats. When we ask Republicans and Democrats today how they feel about the other party, the scores are below 20 for each. And let me give you a little bit of benchmark. That is the same level of coldness that when pollsters used to ask about drug users and rioters in the streets, that's how people rated them, like 15 to 20. That's how we are now rating the other party. And so there's a term that political scientists use all the time. It's affective polarization or negative polarization. And it's the idea that we really, our political beliefs are overwhelmingly now motivated not even by what we like so much about our party, but how much we hate the other party. And so I think this is a newer and very consequential feature of our politics. I think you all experience that all the time out in the world, probably many of you in your own feelings. And so that's a second sort of issue I want to mention. The third thing I'll mention quickly is the Electoral College. And I think all these things are related in some ways that we can talk about. But the Electoral College is something that, of course, we take as a given because it is a given. It's in our Constitution. We can't really do anything about it. But I just want to sort of invite you for a minute to think about how we would think about the world if we didn't have an Electoral College. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by something like 2 or 3 million. Okay? In essentially any other country, that would mean she would be president of the United States. But it's not just that she would be president of the United States and Trump would have lost. Our entire narrative and self-understanding about what America is, what we believe in, what we care about, who we are, I submit would be fundamentally different. I mean, to use a sports analogy for a second, when one team beats another team 5-4, all of the post-game coverage is about how the team that scored 5 runs did everything they needed to do, and how the team that scored 4 runs did everything that made them lose the game, when in fact 1 or 2 plays could have flipped the outcome, and then the post-game coverage would have been exactly the opposite. How the team that scored 4 runs would have done everything right, and the team that scored 5 runs would have done everything wrong. And I really want to emphasize the importance of this for our understanding. And of course, Joe Biden in 2020 won by 7 million votes. That's a substantial number, actually, of 4+ points over Donald Trump. But because of the Electoral College, because of the razor-thin majorities in each of the states almost all the states he needed to secure 270 electoral votes. Again, it gave us a very different impression of who we are and what we believe in as a people than would be the case were there no Electoral College. The same thing is almost certainly likely to happen this year. There's some wonky scenarios. We don't have to get into that, but it is very likely true that Kamala Harris will, even if it's by a narrow margin, win the popular vote. And of course, whether she wins the Electoral College vote is a much more open question. And it's even conceivable, by the way, very unlikely, but conceivable that Donald Trump will win more votes and lose the Electoral College. But I mention the Electoral College because, again, I think it's really important for thinking about how that has driven our narrative about the popularity of Trump, what we believe in, what the hell is going on with Americans, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there and happy to.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me jump in with a couple of questions. I don't even know if I could pass your political science class, so much less. So take this as an amateur.
As we tell our students, there's no such thing as a bad question.
Okay, I'll depend on that. So the first thing I want to go back to in terms of the undecideds, you talked about how the undecideds are going to determine the election, and I want to propose a different scenario, which is my sense of American politics actually since about 2000 has been that it's more about turnout of your base than it is about winning the middle. And if that's the case, then what may determine the election is not necessarily undecideds in the middle, who in the end may be a very small number, but actually people on both peripheries, Democrats and Republicans, who decide whether or not to get in the race, right? Whether or not they care enough. One of the things in a synagogue we'll talk, the voting in Israel is, although it's gotten actually lower in the last 20 to 30 years, is the voting rates in Israel were, I think, around 90 or 95% at a certain time in the country. You can tell us what the voting rates in the United States are, but my sense is far below what a strong.
It's typically about 55 to 60.
55 to 60
presidential elections.
In presidential elections, yeah. And so I just would love to hear you talk about the extent to which that is true. My sense of it is that both of the parties are playing in that direction, and the effect that has on our society.
Yeah, so it's a great question actually, and it's a useful corrective because, when I say undecided, I was thinking partly about people who we might say are in the middle, but undecided, of course, just could be brought into the people who are not sure whether they're going to vote at all. Right. So I'd say a very sort of common debate in politics is, do you play to the middle? Do you try to attract those voters who are identified as moderates or independents as centrists? And it certainly seems that Kamala Harris, to a significant degree, is pursuing that strategy. Or do you play to mobilize your base? And at least from what we can see, Donald Trump is trying to do more of that than she is. Where I would say the overlap is that I think what is true, both of those people who we would say in the middle and those people who we might think of as part of our base but are less likely to turn out, is that in general, they are lower propensity voters. That for whatever reason, they are typically less motivated to vote. There are some people who know they're going to vote no matter what, and they haven't figured it out. But there's a lot of people in that sort of mushy middle who are undecided in a way that mean they may not show up at all. And then there's people who, if they did show up, we likely would know who they're going to vote for, but for whatever reason they feel disaffected, or I don't know, they're 22 years old and they don't get their registration in on time, or something like that. So I do think we're talking about, you're right, that's also a group of people who exist in the electorate and might be more motivated to vote if they liked what they heard more from their candidates, if they felt more spoken to. I will say, Rabbi, one thing that gives me pause is, as somebody on the left side of the political spectrum, I long believed that if we, meaning liberals, did a better job of mobilizing more of the electorate, then more of the unmobilized are on our side than their side, and therefore we would do better in elections. And I'm not sure I believe that to the same degree anymore. And one reason I say that is because in 2020, it's all relative. We had our highest turnout election in 2020 since 1968. 1968 is the last election before 18-year-olds got the right to vote. And ever since then, we've had lower turnout because 18 to 21-year-olds are less likely to turn out. So in 2020, we had the highest turnout election we've had in 42 years, 52 years, and still the pattern was the same. A very close election, a 50-50 election. So I'm less convinced, I guess, that those unmobilized voters, not that they're not important to reach for other reasons, sort of would have a decisive influence on the outcome of the race. It might be that if we got turnout up to 70%, let's say, the division would still be roughly the same as it is. I don't know if that's true, but it's possible.
Can you say a little bit more, if you know, or what we know about? You gave one example, the 21-year-old. We helped ours to get
Yeah.
to get registered and everything like that. But the 21-year-old who just isn't organized in life. And can you say any more about who not the undecideds, but sort of the undecideds in the sense of these people on the periphery who are like, I don't know whether I care enough. What is driving the apathy, and what, if anything, do we know? Does Beyonce coming out, move the meter in terms of people participating in the process?
I mean, I had a moment of excitement when on the night of the Harris-Trump debate, it was that same night that Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala. I admit I was very excited that night. But I don't know, and if Taylor Swift can't move the needle, I'm not sure anybody can. She is the world's most famous and popular pop star. I think that we've done a lot of Jeff and I and others in this room I know have done a lot of canvassing over the years. When I think about I think at least some of the people you're asking about, and I'm not saying this to be insulting or anything, it's just true. There are doors we knock on where people are like, oh, this is a presidential election here. They just don't know. And I don't think that's a huge percentage of our country, but I don't think it's tiny either. So I think to some degree, it's disengagement on that very basic level. And I think there's also a lot of people, and they tell us this, they don't feel like either party speaks to the things they most care about. They're struggling to get by. They feel like their life circumstances are not materially going to change, regardless of who's in power. So I think those are at least some reasons why people are not motivated to vote. I will also say, if you look at other countries where turnout is higher, this isn't true everywhere, but a lot of countries in Europe, for example, have some kind of inducement, usually a negative one, to make people vote, that you'll be fined or you'll have some sort of tax penalty if you don't vote. And that is at least one reason why a lot of European countries have higher turnout. And I both wonder whether if they didn't, their turnout would look more like ours, and that if we did, our turnout would look more like theirs. So I think there's probably at least some of that sort of like structural institutional rulemaking that also affects who comes out and who doesn't.
And do we have a sense of what actually does move the meter? I think it's very interesting just to know about other models, right? Where there are, in America, we're sort of so free that we allow people not to participate in these things. But other things besides, Taylor Swift that move the meter?
Well, I'm going to stay with the celebrity thing for a second because I was just reading recently about the Democrats have developed what they believe this year is, and I've seen some of them refer to it this way, as a sort of scientific way of measuring which celebrities will appeal to which group of people. And they've actually assigned scores to these different celebrities and scores to the groups of people they think they would appeal to. So, I mean, there's one list that I was actually showing Amy and Louise today. The most popular celebrity in terms of if you subtract negative feeling from positive feeling in the United States is Samuel L. Jackson. Okay, and actually Shaquille O'Neal is very high on the list. LeBron James. It's mostly men, which is itself kind of interesting. But the Democrats have decided we're going to put these celebrities. They're going to put Liz Cheney in front of certain groups of people. They're going to put Samuel L. Jackson in front of other groups of people, and they're going to do this because they've decided somehow that doing so is the thing that will get through to otherwise unmotivated voters. But I want to say this about that, and this is really to your larger question. Political science has been studying intensively for decades things like what kinds of television ads work. Do negative ads work more than positive ads? What kinds of ads? What kinds of messaging? Other appeals to policy platforms, etc. We have, and I mean this speaks to I don't know how much time political scientists have wasted. We have very little insight. The truth is, to what motivates the not already motivated people. And so there's been a ton of research on ads. I mean, those of you who are watching television, we're in a swing state, God help us. And so we're just being bombarded, as you know, with one ad after another. And we really don't know whether that moves the needle at all. All we know is that whichever side you're on, you cannot afford to unilaterally disarm. So if the other side's going to blanket the airwaves, you have to blanket the airwaves. There's no way you're going to not do that because you can't afford even the possibility that failing to do everything the other side does will cost you the election. But so it's an unsatisfying answer, but I would say we just don't know a whole lot about what moves people except, and this is really sort of to wrap up the sort of polarization piece. We know that partisanship remains by far the biggest sort of explanatory variable for why people vote. If you're a Republican, you're voting for the Republican. And that is more true today than it has been at any time really in modern times. And it is one reason why, for example, many people who otherwise say there's all sorts of things, for example, they don't like about Trump for this or that reason, but they are absolutely going to vote for him and every other Republican regardless.
So let me ask one more
Yeah.
question, and then we'll open it up. And here maybe this is more of a rabbi question, and it does actually come back to polarization, because as a rabbi, my observation is that during elections, discourse is weaponized. Speech, whether it's ads that are running or just even conversations, right, that you're having with another person. The real danger is that the conversations that we're having with our fellow citizens are now turned into the battlefield of political discourse when and there's a very instrumental element to that, and that ultimately is not good for community. And so the question that I have, I do remember, I don't know how many of you were here, but the morning when the Shabbat morning after Trump was elected, and there were people who, as we tried to sort of give space to acknowledge that, there was some yelling and screaming, right? And ultimately, I look back on that and I say that was just what needed to happen in the space. That there were people who were that scared and that upset, and people who responded to that and felt unseen and unsafe in the community. And there's a desire. My task and my hope, and it is an impossible one, is to try to hold a community together. And so I guess my question to you is sort of knowing that actually what works, is partisanship and knowing that our discourse goes through these periods of weaponization. Are there things that we know that depolarize? Are there things that are practiced that help people to see the humanization of the other side?
I'll say a couple of quick things about that because I want everyone to have a chance to jump in who wants to. Um, there's a surprisingly, it's a little less lively nowadays, but there's still a debate in political science about whether we're really as polarized as some people like me say we are. And those who say we're less polarized will point to things like just in the electorate, for example, there's just a lot more support for gay rights, for example, than there used to be. And if you ask people about issues, um, there's a narrative that says we're not farther apart than we used to be on some of the key issues. And so what's really driving us is starting with these elites who are, it's in their interest to divide the electorate in a particular way. And once they've done so, to kind of double down on that. And so I guess I mentioned that to say that sort of at the level of normal people, there's lots of emotionality and lots of acrimony for sure. But I think there's all kinds of contexts and spaces in which people would rather not feel like they've got to be sort of psychically armed to the teeth in order to do combat against their fellow citizens who disagree with them. There are many kinds of initiatives, community-based initiatives. There's a well-known political philosopher, Danielle Allen, is one of the people who's trying to find spaces for people who have political differences to come together and talk to each other. I do think that as long as sort of our elite politics are as kind of, to use your term, as weaponized as they are, it's going to be very difficult for us normal people to not follow suit. I just think that's the nature of the beast. But I don't think it's necessarily as inherent in us as a lot of the scholarship, including my own, would suggest it is. But it's hard to not see it that way, given the way our politics looks like nowadays.
And I'll just add as we take questions, there is a bunch of clergy in Durham who are going to be holding a vigil actually on the night before the election,
Okay.
and to try to just hold some space to remind us of our humanity. Daniel, go ahead.
So you can hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So starting with Clinton's comment in 2016 about
Sorry to interrupt. Please ask, and I wasn't saying this because of the way you began.
Oh, sure.
Please ask a question, okay? Do not use this as a time to narrate. Think about your question, what it is. Go ahead.
So, what's your name? No. Starting with 2016 when Clinton talked about the deplorables, and then in a lot of polling, there's talk about kind of how uneducated people or people without a college degree are tending towards Trump. It seems like that's the Democrat Party losing touch with its base. I think.
I'm sorry, say that
I
last
think that it seems like that's the Democrat Party losing touch with what historically was its base. And I wonder if you could explain if you agree with that and how that happened.
Yeah, so I'll try to, it's a bit, I'm sorry, so the question is, starting with Hillary Clinton's comment about deplorables in 2016, and the Democrats increasingly becoming the party of the college educated, have the Democrats lost touch with their traditional base in the working class? So that's a big, important question. I'll try to answer it briefly. There's no question that the Democratic Party is increasingly the home of the college educated. Political scientists talk about a diploma divide and the degree to which that is now foundational to our politics, and certainly among the white working class in particular, who in another time and place were rock solid, pro-New Deal FDR Democrats, who really since the 1980s, first with the so-called Reagan Democrats, and increasingly in recent decades, have gravitated to the Republican Party. There's an interesting sort of, in some ways, parallel movement going on, maybe among non-white voters who still are predominantly going to vote Democratic, but somewhat less reliably so. There may be a class divide there as well. So there's no question what you said is correct. It is happening. Why it's happening is really big and complicated. I will say that one thing that's happened that I think is interesting is that there's a parallel urban-rural divide that has become very pronounced, and the Democratic Party has increasingly emphasized the importance of those urban and suburban communities that are college educated, that are knowledge workers, and they have tried, especially in recent years actually, to articulate more ambitious economic programs that will appeal to those working class voters. But I think what's happened is those working class voters have found this is a complicated story, but a lot of those working class voters, not all of them, have found the kind of conservative cultural appeals of Republicans resonate much more with them than do the efforts by Democrats to extend the child tax credit, for example. So that's a much longer, complicated story, but there's no question what you described is correct. That is happening, and it is only intensifying with each election cycle. And by the way, it's not just happening in the United States, it's happening all over the Western world. France, Germany, Britain, etc. So, which is its own interesting story.
Is the Electoral College obsolete, and is it feasible for it to be disbanded?
I mean, it will take a constitutional amendment to change it, which makes it, I would say, out of reach, essentially, at least for the near future. At some point in the future, when it doesn't clearly advantage one party or another, there might be a coming together of the two parties that say, actually, now would be a good time to change this. But at least for now, I think it's an impossibility. I will say very quickly, there has been this sort of, it's a correct sense that Democrats have faced an electoral college disadvantage in recent elections, that they have to win the overall popular vote by something like 3 percentage points to overcome their disadvantage in the electoral college. There's some reason to believe that that disadvantage has shrunk significantly in this election, which is also interesting, so that Democrats may not pay the same penalty that they very much paid in 2016 and also in 2020 this year. So.
Thank you. I have to say, first of all, you really struck a chord with me. I voted on Tuesday, and I stood for 5 minutes deciding who to vote for.
Okay.
My question is really, I'm a strong defender of the Electoral College, and we won't get into that debate right now,
Yeah.
but it's the basis of my question. I've studied third parties in the United States since the anti-Masonic Party in the 19th century. I've studied it through Eugene Debs, through the Dixiecrats, the Greens, Libertarians. Why can't we obtain more than two parties in the United States? Why is there such a barrier against more choice?
It's a great question, actually, and I'm sorry, I'm only going to give a shorter answer now, but one of the biggest barriers is we do, in an institutional and legal sense, really have a two-party duopoly. The two parties control, in many ways, the rules and laws that pertain to ballot access. And we also, and I know this is sort of, in some ways it's a circular argument, but I still think it's a correct argument. I think Americans are so convinced that there really is no reason to vote for a third party other than out of protest that isn't simply a wasted vote, that if they are going to vote at all, they're just going to vote for Democrats or Republicans. I do wonder, to our earlier discussion about the large number of non-voters in the United States, whether if there were a more viable, robust third party, that turnout might be higher because there would be, some traction for a third party. Now, I will also say, we, like the British, have in our Congress, them in their parliament, we have what's called the first past the post system. it's the winner of different parliamentary or congressional districts. Whoever has the most votes wins that election. That makes it very difficult for a third party to break through. But interestingly, the British have the same thing, and they have more viable, they can't win elections, but they have third parties that actually get decent traction in their politics. So I think it's a combination of our rules and our political culture that leaves us in the position we're in.
I have a question.
Yes.
Now you can hear me. Okay. You said the temperature poll thing, 20% is how they, or 20 degrees is what they're now,
Yeah.
the opposite party.
And sinking fast, by the way.
But I'm wondering, with all the just in the last month, all the Trump people who've come out for Harris, do you think that might have made a difference?
The short answer is I don't know. You know, it's an interesting dynamic, I think, especially in the Republican Party nowadays, that if you are not pro-Trump, you are what's often referred to as a rhino, Republican in name only, and you're essentially excommunicated. And so, I mean, just to give two examples, Liz Cheney, who's a very conservative politician with a rock-ribbed conservative voting record. There's nothing liberal about her, of course, but on the one issue that she sacrificed her political career for, which was on January 6th, she was doing that while she was running for re-election in Wyoming, and she lost by like 35 points. The other Republican congressman who's sort of very much associated with the January 6th committee is Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, who didn't even bother to run for re-election because he knew what would happen once he came out against Trump. So there is this, I do feel like, reinforcing dynamic in the Republican Party today, that the moment you come out against Trump, you are, for most of the party, I don't want to speak for, I obviously can't, there might be some Republicans who that will give them pause, but overwhelmingly, the moment you come out for Trump is the moment you are excommunicated from the party. And so from that perspective, I'm not confident that it's going to make nearly the difference that the Harris campaign. It doesn't mean that there won't be some Republican defections this year. There very well may. But I just don't know how much something like that.
Let's take one more here, two more, and then I'm going to wrap up with, I'm going to seize the last question.
So I have a question about gerrymandering. But first, you were saying about 50% of Americans vote in presidential elections. I was very active in Chapel Hill politics in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I was horrified in that very educated community that 16% of people voted in non-presidential elections, which is horrible. So I don't know what's going to get people to vote. So maybe you can help us. But my question is about gerrymandering in North Carolina. I thought there was a law that they had to connect all of those lines, and then they never did. And is there no repercussions, and how's it going to impact this election?
Yeah. So very quickly, when Republicans took over the state legislature in 2010, which is very unfortunately coincided with a census year, which meant they had the opportunity to redraw the districts. That plus new software that allows the map drawers to be very precise in how they draw their districts. They drew the districts in such a way that the congressional delegation was overwhelmingly Republican, even though in congressional elections, North Carolinians vote basically 50-50 Democrat and Republican. So in 2017, there was a court case, and that court case showed that, as the court put it, with surgical precision, the Republican legislature gerrymandered, it was a racial gerrymander, to And courts stepped in then and forced them to redistrict, which they did after 2020, which is why our current congressional delegation is 7-7. However, and this is why it's very important to vote in state judicial races, FYI, once a new Republican majority took over the state Supreme Court, the legislature re-gerrymandered, and that was appealed to the Supreme Court, which this time said the maps are fine. So that's why we are where we are. And that's why this coming year we're likely back to like a 10-5 split or something like that.
So Kay over here, and then we'll wrap up.
Considering that a lot of Trump's popularity is a cult of personality, do you think that that can transfer to J.D. Vance?
It's a great question. I feel like, so the question is, considering a lot of Trump support is a cult of personality, can this transfer to J.D. Vance? This is a larger question about whether Trumpism will persist after Trump. I happen to be writing a book about this right now, so I'll answer that question in 2026 if that's.
You back.
Okay,
We'll have you back. We'll have you
No.
back.
So my short answer is, I know that a lot of liberals, including me, don't like to admit this, but Trump indisputably has a special appeal. And I don't know that will, I'm of two minds. I mean, on the one hand, I do think that the party has been captured by Trumpism in such a way that the base of the party, which very consequentially is the group of voters who show up for primaries, are going to continue to elect Trumpist candidates like Mark Robinson, just to take one example. And I don't think that's going to go away immediately. Clearly, if Trump wins this time, that's going to mean that this will be perpetuated much longer. But if Trump loses, and some of these candidates like Kari Lake in Arizona and Mark Robinson and Bernie Moreno in Ohio, some of the more extreme candidates do as badly as they've been doing, and they have performed very poorly all in all, that might mean that that tendency will begin to wane in American. But nothing sobers up a political party like losing consistently. But I think that's the first thing that has to happen before there's a meaningful political change.
So the question I wanted to come back to you on, and I'm surprised that it hasn't come up, but that's okay. What about the Jews? Okay, and I guess in a synagogue, I sort of want to ask you, when I was growing up, Jews represented a very important swing vote. For example, in Florida, when Florida turned the 2000 election, and
because of the 3,000 Jews who voted for Buchanan,
right,
who didn't really vote for Buchanan, but yeah,
and all that, and I think the concern this year has been about the war in Israel and the way in which that will affect the support for Democrats in Michigan. I just would, I just want to ask your sense of where do you see the impact of Jews on this election, and also, I'm not the first one to notice that in many ways the Jewish influence in terms of being a swing vote that really turns elections has, I think, waned. And where do you see where do you see that going?
I mean, I'm going to try to avoid some landmines here, but
I just put them out
Yeah,
for you.
you
So,
did,
but yes, avoid
But
them.
actually, to go back to the point, I guess he's left, but about the Electoral College, one argument people used to make about why the Electoral College was still worth keeping was that it amplified the influence of minorities that otherwise have no influence. So, for example, with an Electoral College, you actually worry about Jews in New York and Florida, whereas if we're just one big 200 million person electorate, you're not worried about Jews at all. And I would say this year that you have reason to be worried about an otherwise very small minority in the population as a whole, Arab Americans, but their concentration in Michigan a swing state means they might have a consequential impact on this election. So that is an argument that people have historically made about the Electoral College generally. I mean, in terms of the Jews in this election, I'm boring about this in the sense that the best data we have is that consistently for many cycles now, Jews vote something like 3-1 for Democrats. And I fully expect roughly the same thing to happen this year again. What's interesting about the Jewish vote, and Peter Beinart first wrote about this 20 years ago, actually. He wrote an article in the Washington Post on the eve of the 2004 election about what he called the end of the Jewish vote. And what he argued was the end of the Jewish vote meant that the Jews were now split in much the same way that other communities were by cultural conservatism versus cultural liberalism. And so overwhelmingly, that 25% of Jews, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, those are going to be Orthodox Jews who are going to vote Republican, and the rest are going to vote overwhelmingly Democratic. I think that is mainly true this time, with the interesting caveat that we'll see there is a rift, as we know, in our community about Israel-Palestine among young people in our community. If Jews are a small percentage of the population, young Jews are a really small percentage of the population, so I don't know exactly what the electoral impact is, but I think that's another kind of interesting dynamic to think about in our community, especially in subsequent elections.
And the Orthodox Jews is just a very good example of how the cultural issue, those Orthodox Jews live in urban settings.
Yes, they do. You're right.
That's not,
No,
that is not
correct.
rural urban.
No.
That is a cultural as opposed to,
100%.
yeah.
And they are now strong Trump supporters.
I want to say a huge thank you to Jonathan. As many of my teachers have said, for sharing light and not heat, for helping us all to think and to see more clearly, and I just do want to again plug the next month as Abdullah Intepli comes, but as the election approaches, I deeply hope that we can continue to be in community together. And that we should, I think we surround ourselves with people who think and probably vote the way that we do, and one of the richest, one of the, I think the most treasured aspects of synagogues and churches in the United States is that they can be these spaces where we can meet and care for and be in community with people who think differently than we do. And I pray that that continues to be the case. And I will just say, I pray that God continues to bless this country because we need it. We need it. Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom.